So today's webinar, we're going to focus on looking at how to ensure that a final element assembly would meet the requirements of the functional safety standards, specifically 61511. So our webinar today is Functional Safety Assessment of Valve Assemblies. I'm Chris O'Brien. I'll be leading this webinar. I'm a partner with Exida and spent most of my career in automation and safety-related applications. And I work with our OEM customers and our end-user customers, so I have a pretty good feel for both sides of the standards and how they're applied. So my background is mechanical engineering, and I'm happy to be able to lead you through this today. As most people probably already know that are on the call, but Exida is a global organization with functional safety experts located around the world to help our customers meet their needs. And we provide a pretty complete line of services and tools and training for this market. So we provide consulting, we provide product certification, training classes, a whole suite of software tools, and then we also try to write and publish a lot of material to document procedures and thoughts, and finally can work with organizations and people for functional safety certification of personnel. Our tool suite, as I mentioned, will help somebody completely implement the 61511 lifecycle, and we also, as I said, have an extensive library. So, getting to today's topics, though, so today we want to talk about functional safety and automated valves. And during the presentation today, if you've got questions, you can type them into the question box. I'll try to keep an eye on that and answer them as they come up, and at the end we'll certainly regroup and go through them all, so we address everything. The topics I'd like to touch on today are the trends that we're seeing emerging in the market related to valve assemblies, how those trends relate and touch on or reflect the IEC 61511 requirements, and take a look at what's in a final element. I know that seems a pretty simplistic thing, but sometimes when you look at the different devices that go into some of these safety systems, the final element becomes quite complex. I want to talk a little bit about requirements traceability, then about verification and validation of that final element, and then finally wrap it up with talks about what are some of the practical paths to show compliance in the plant or in a real environment. So we've seen, Exida has seen over the last about 2.5 years a pretty marked increase in requests for certified final element assemblies. And we've also, from feedback from the OEMs that we work with, the valve and actuator OEMs we work with, they're also seeing a strong uptick. So previously, if we go back 5 years ago or more, occasionally, maybe like once a year, I would hear from an OEM saying, oh, my customer just asked me if we had a certificate for this whole assembly. But that seems to be changing, and I think it reflects that as the market is maturing, more process owners are looking at what do they really need to do to show and demonstrate that they are fully compliant with IEC 61511. So we know that the requests are coming from engineering contractors on behalf of customers for large plants, and we know they're also coming directly from those customers. So I think that it's primarily the maturity level of the market is increasing. So it might seem like overkill. It might seem like, well, that's not, is that really necessary if you buy a certified valve and a certified actuator? But when we take a look at what actually goes into these final elements, I think we'll see that there can be quite a bit of complexity, and there is the requirement within 61511 to demonstrate that the equipment used in these safety systems will function correctly. So what's really required by the standards, and if we just look at this graphic, is the assembly or the work being done on the left-hand side of the screen equivalent to what might come fully integrated on the right-hand side of the screen. Now, the answer is it absolutely can be equivalent. In fact, sometimes maybe it could even be better, but there is this lack of, or this need for visibility and transparency and traceability that what gets installed at the plant and run does meet all the functional requirements of the safety requirements spec and can be audited and demonstrated to do what it needs to do. Now, there's no prescriptive path in the standard saying that you must buy an integrated valve assembly or you can't do certain things, but there are requirements to show that traceability and to show a reasonable amount of evidence for verification and validation that the system will function correctly. When we look at 61511, we can definitely pull out some areas that looking at a complex final element will touch upon. So the first is SIL verification. Now, obviously, anything that's part of the safety critical path has to be included in that SIL verification calculation. We'll dig into each of these bullets a little more. Second is design. So anything used in a safety instrumented function has to be assessed to 61508 or justified based on prior use. And depending on the complexity of some of these things, that may not be being covered. Then the assembly and integration of that final element has requirements validating that it's working correctly functionally, and then finally being able to review all these things or show the evidence that a functional assessment number 3 is a specific requirement. So I think often when any of us think about final elements, and if we're looking at this webinar is kind of directed at the process industry, and so we're primarily going to talk about valve and actuators. So, but it could be extended to other applications as well. But when we think about the final element, what immediately comes to mind is the valve, the actuator, and probably some type of control device like a solenoid. However, depending on, so that's kind of the minimum you need in your final element, but most times there's additional things. You're certainly going to need some type of integration in the sense of a mounting brackets, which may or may not be part of the valve assembly, and in coupling devices. Now, in addition to that, now sometimes some OEMs have these couplings and these connector devices included in their valve or actuator, and they would then be part of the valve actuator assessment. However, many don't. They're just, there's a stem that could be connected to an actuator stem, but then you need an independent way of coupling it, or you need the mounting bracket, or you need the hardware to do it. So understanding if all those parts are included in the OEM scope or if they're added on is important. Beyond that, there can be things such as feedback devices for automated testing or proof testing. There can be functional devices like quick exhaust valves or volume boosters, to quick exhaust valves or volume boosters to make sure that the assembly is moving quickly enough. And there can be double acting actuators or hydraulic or pneumatic assist return actuators, and in that case then the hydraulic supply or the pneumatic supply needs to be considered as well. So these, a final element can have quite a few things in addition to the valve and actuator. In addition to making sure we have the right parts included or have included all the parts that are necessary, we need to be able to show requirements traceability down through the design of the safety instrumented function and then to the specific devices and the final elements. So, of course, there'll be, if it's a safety instrumented system, there'll be a safety instrumented function SRS that'll describe what the function needs to do. That can be decomposed down into what we want, what we need from the sensor, the logic solver, and the final element. And as I just mentioned, typically as a minimum in the final element, we're going to have valve, actuator, and solenoid, and sometimes many other things. But then the functional requirements as to what does the system need to do, what's the time requirements, what's the diagnostic requirements, what are integrity requirements such as what sill level does it need to meet. All of those requirements need to be traceable down and applied as appropriate to the devices that go into the final element, and then also be able to be validated coming back out of that integration step to show that they've been met. If we look at sill verification, the key thing here is that all components that are part of an assembly need to be included in the calculation. And I mentioned before about some OEMs have the coupling and bracketing with their device. Many don't. So I would probably say, from my experience, less than 20% of valve and actuators have all the components in there that you need to assemble, or that you would actually need to do include all the parts that go into the final assembly to make it a working final assembly. So really the failure, those components such as a coupling need to be identified and need to be added into the sill verification calculation as potential additional failures. And so you need a pretty good, you need a list of what's in that final element, and then also things such as feedback switches. If the switches are just there for information and you're not claiming diagnostics such as partial valve stroke testing, then you don't need to be as concerned about them. But if you've done your sill verification calculations taking credit for partial valve stroke testing or an automated proof test, and you're counting on those feedback switches to be there, then you can see that whatever it takes to mount them and the switches themselves need to be included in the calculations. And it could be switches or it could be a position feedback device. So that's an important step to ensure occurs. Now, in addition to including the parts, we need to make sure that they're designed properly. So this can go to first thing, or a first critical thing would be sizing the actuator and the valve correctly. You don't want to put, if you undersize the actuator, it's not going to have enough force to close the valve at maximum conditions. If you oversize the actuator, then you run the risk of snapping the valve stem. So that's a risk. And there's a question. So the question was, can we get PFD average value for each valve component from the vendors? So you should be able to get failure rates for the devices that the manufacturer is making. So like they should have an FMEDA with failure rates for their valve. They also should be able to tell you whether or not they've included coupling in that. And then if not, a source for, if it's not included, then a source for information could be like our Exeter produces a component reliability database. So there's failure rates for things such as like couplings and bolts and things like that. Another thing we can do, and I'll make a note, is we can actually add some of those things to our SillSafe data website, where you can look up kind of generic numbers, so we could put information in for brackets and couplings and things like that. Another question was, how would Excellentia take into account position detection when using partial stroke testing? How that happens is if you use partial valve stroke testing or partial stroke testing as a diagnostic, you can recategorize some of the dangerous failures from dangerous undetected to dangerous detected. So you would include that, and then the position switches then would be enunciation failure, so that failure rate would be treated as an enunciation failure or a diagnostic failure within Excellentia. So it's by selecting partial stroke testing, and you can either manually enter what failures are recategorized as dangerous detected, or you can use some recommended values that Excellentia would give you. So thank you, those are good questions. Now, back to design. So we need to size the actuator to the valve to do that correctly. Then things like mounting brackets and couplings have to be designed to have the strength, not just strength, but rigidity, so we don't get misalignment over time to do the job. Touching back on system design of diagnostic, when you did the SIL verification, did you claim credit for partial valve stroke testing? And if you did, then did you design a final element that really is doing that? So I've got a few good questions. I'm going to circle back to them at the end, so thank you. Keep them coming. Or not at the end, as we get to the question section. So when you can see where design is an issue, and it is important that, because one of the questions was just about, hey, if I'm an integrator, I can't necessarily take, if I'm a control system integrator, I don't know that the mechanical design was done correctly, and that's very true. And the key point here is that somebody needs to own that. And just as if the valve manufacturer under-designed the valve stem and it wasn't going to work, we need to be sure, we collectively as professionals in functional safety need to be sure that those components that are going into that assembly are properly designed. So it's not that every bracket manufacturer has to be 61508 certified, but there should be some traceability or some methodology to show that, yes, we used good design principles, we had a specification, we designed to it, we recorded the results, and here's our objective evidence that this is valid and this design will work. So there is a degree of rigor and traceability that is required in both the design of these components and the production and assembly of these components. Typically, a mechanical design process will generate these types of documents. Most will be ISO certified. There'll be a written design procedure. There'll be a requirement specification. There'll be a design file that has drawings, stress, as a minimum, drawings, stress calculations. If it's going to be a high cycle application, life cycle tests, material compatibility, how do they manage their suppliers, how do they integrate the valve and actuator if we just say focus on brackets, and how do they test it. So it is different, and I think if we even just pause on this page, this I think is a reason or explanation as to, well, why are more process owners coming back and asking for a certified assembly? Well, because there are areas that of a documented design process needs to be used. So while a semi-formal or good experience or a reputable, valve integrator may be okay for general, may or may not be okay. It's going to be for the ultimate user to decide. For general process requirements, it doesn't meet the rigor and traceability that 61508 requires. So, and that's very hard. Once you get those valves in the plan, it's very hard to go back and generate or collect that evidence. So if we look at, a simplified, and I would say by no means is this all-inclusive or encompassing, but if we look at these kind of steps we need to show evidence for, then we could say, well, what are the beginning documents, or what are the things we would look for? In still verification, you're going to need to know, one, all the components and parts that are in there, and two, what are the failure rates of those parts? From the design, who's ever designing those components, you need the functional requirements and a formal design process. For assembly integration, you need formal procedures. And then for the validation or verification of the functionality, you're going to need a test plan in the shop, and you're also going to need a site acceptance test plan to show that, the first thing is we can start like, okay, the valve was manufactured correctly. Then yes, we designed all the right, or selected all the right parts, and we integrated them correctly. And then they get to the shop or to the site, and then they're deployed correctly. And then finally, for Functional Safety Assessment 3, is there the proper documentation where we can trace back through and show these steps have been completed? So one comment or one question is that it's not always possible to get the failure rates for all the components, and I think the person is saying that 90% of the time we don't have them. So that's true. And I did make a note that actually I could put some of those on the website just for the generic parts you need to consider in a valve assembly. And we do have a site, silsafedata.com, where we've begun to post some generic data for devices, and we can add these components to it. Then I'm just kind of scrolling. I'm pausing just to scroll through the questions. So it is true that another person commented, as a control system or electronic integrator, it's difficult to take ownership and verify the mechanical design was done correctly. And that's true. So that's where you would need your suppliers to be giving you documentation and evidence that they had done that correctly. This is a very good one about asking, valve assemblies are composed of a lot of components. How do you know which ones are critical? So that I would recommend doing a failure modes and effect analysis. And basically what you're doing there is to say, what are all the components that are in the final element? What's their function? Are they safety critical or not? And then if they're safety critical, what are the functional failure modes we're worried about? Because, for example, there could be a quick exhaust valve. But if the quick exhaust valve is just there because it's nice to have and you'd like it to close sooner, but you don't have to for safety, then obviously you wouldn't include it. Or I mentioned before that like a hydraulic assist spring return actuator. So it's often common to if you to have that, ideally, or opt for a safety application, it's designed, hey, it just closes quicker, but if we don't have hydraulic supply, it's not safety critical. The spring will still close. So a a failure modes effect analysis is a good way to do that. Then we have a question on what's the rule for considering diagnostic coverage? Is there guidelines for that? Where somebody have competitors claiming high diagnostic coverage to improve upon final values. Now, kind of a rule of thumb or a starting point, if somebody is claiming dangerous detected failure rates for a valve or actuator without stipulating like a partial valve stroke test, then it's invalid. I've seen some certificates where they're claiming, diagnostic coverage and no mention of any type of testing. So that's not really valid. There is guidance in 61508 as far as what type of coverage to claim and you kind of build it up from the component level, but you can have low, medium, high effectiveness diagnostics. Low is 60%, medium is 90, and high is 99. And then you need to apply that to the functional failure mode and the test. So yes, there is guidance. We've got some recorded webinars on that. We'll be doing some more on that. But often, going along the same road, I've seen, a proof test. If you see coverage above 70% or 75% and people aren't requiring a leak test, then it's probably an indication it's invalid, and we can help you with that, and maybe take it offline to look at specific applications. But there is guidance in the standard on what you can claim, and there should be traceability and a reasonableness test. Another question was what's covered by Functional Safety Assessment 3. That's the essentially everything through system design, risk targeting, system design, system implementation. You have to show evidence that that's all correct in the IEC 61511 life cycle. So it's the process hazard analysis and the design and implementation main phases, and there's lots of steps in there. So that's that safety review that must be conducted prior to the hazard being present. So FSA 3 covers all of that. And you can imagine that this kind of leads into our next slide when we talk about, well, how do you show compliance? You could do a final inspection or a field inspection after everything's installed. You could order a certified assembly, or I think maybe a more practical approach is going to be a certified integration process. So field inspection, well, that's obviously the easiest to implement. It can be used with installed final elements, but you're only going to be able to check some of the requirements. So for example, it doesn't provide information on the design of the integration components. There certainly would be cases where if the bracket was made out of 16th inch steel, you'd say, wow, that's not going to hold up. And if it was made machined out of a solid block, you'd say, well, that's probably overkill. But ideally, you really want that design evidence so you get the best design. And so that's kind of where the market is now, but that's also, I think, people probably, often we see more requests from end users after they've been bitten or had some trouble in the field. Second approach is, the first reaction is to say, okay, well, then we just want to buy certified assemblies. So that's fine. We can have a formal third-party review of a specific design. It's got a high degree of traceability because the third party should be documenting everything and being able to provide an assessment report. It's going to be a higher cost because you're doing a lot of, you're completely checking everything on every assembly. And it's going to be a longer lead time, so it's higher cost and longer lead time because each assembly needs to be looked at, and each variation would need to be looked at. Because basically certifying assembly is saying, I've looked at instant XYZ of this valve actuator assembly for this customer, and it's correct. Probably a more pragmatic approach that's going to give pretty much the same benefit as a certified assembly, but be more practical, would be to extend certification not just to say valve design or actuator design, but to include the integration process, because many OEMs integrate actuators and devices in their factory on orders. They don't do it all the time, obviously, but if a customer orders an integrated assembly, they'll do that. So typically, those OEMs or integrators who are already kind of doing 61508 work are going to have a robust ISO process. They're going to have procedures that already meet the requirements of IEC 61508, including requirements traceability, design files. I mean, those finite element analysis and that type of design analysis that I laid out earlier, companies that are building valves and doing integration or building actuators and doing integration, they do that. They also have formal manufacturing procedures and tests. They have traceable shipment and return records. So they've got, a lot of, they've got 95% of what they need to do covered by their basic product certification. Then there are some, but there would be additional steps of, depending on the complexity, they might have to be able to trace the safety requirement specs down through the final element, and might need to do a simple FMEA to say, safety critical, not safety critical parts. Do so verification calculations. So it's not completely covered already, but they're a fair way down the road. And certainly there are other, none of this in the standard says you must have a third-party cert. It's basically you need to be able to show the evidence. So process owners could do these steps themselves as well. So key takeaways: process owners are seeking more transparency and traceability for integrated final elements. We talked about there's valid reasons for this, because not everything is immediately transparent or visible if you look at things at the very end after everything's built and installed. And we see a trend to including or extending the certification to the integration process for device OEMs, and we think this is a good step, and we'll start closing that gap. So now we got some more questions, which is great. Oh, I didn't know that guy would spin, sorry. Does Exida have figures showing relative importance of failures of actuators, valves versus mechanical couplings? No, but we could do that, and I'll take these questions as doing it. But I would say it's certainly, I would estimate off the top of my head, which is always dangerous, that it's probably a 5 to 10% impact, because the force transfer and the stresses between the mounting adapters and the couplings is significant. So it's not like a 1% issue. It would move the PFD average some, but we can run some calculations. One question is familiar with the OEM acronyms. So for example, original equipment manufacturer. So typically we would say OEM for a valve manufacturer or a actuator manufacturer or a solenoid manufacturer, an integrator for a valve integrator. What's the difference between SIL verification of valve automation systems and one with a logic solver included? So I don't know if I'm going to, so if there's a logic solver, then the valve system would be the final element. It would be part of the overall SIF calculation, and it would be the final element subsystem. There are some safety systems that are all kind of hydraulic or pneumatic driven, and in that case you would just model the sensor and the logic solver. Yeah, I did one system that was a gas line pipeline shut down, and it had a pressure relay that was connected to a gap controller that was all hydraulic, and that directly would trip the valve. In that case, you just model the whole system, and there's no logic solver, but there's equivalent pneumatic or hydraulic components. Should we specify certified integration process in the specification on off valves used for safety applications? I would probably recommend either that or listing the minimum evidence documents you'd want to see. So, say, must provide calculations, must provide test plans, must provide ISO cert. So I think that having some, if you ask for it up front, you've got a much better chance of getting it, and it does help the integrator or who's ever supplying it think about those steps before they're done. Does Excellency have the ability to add the many components that make up the final element? Yes, you might have to group them. You might have to add a my own that says components, but you can certainly add, there's at least two or three, in addition to the valve and actuator, there's 2 or 3 additional components that could be added, such as quick exhaust valve or solenoid. So one of those you could do a my own and say integration components. Can we self-certify to SIL verification or SIL loop? I'm not sure if this is from a end user perspective or a process owner perspective. Certainly you can validate or say you've reviewed and done your system. If you're an OEM, the requirements on certification, you've got requirements for independence. So the higher the SIL level you go, you need to show more independence and evidence of capability. However, for a SIL calculation or a SIL verification report, that's quite transparent. So, you could just provide the evidence to say, here's our evidence showing that this final element we've included and considered everything. And that's more to the point that I think that Exit is saying, that you don't really need to certify every possible valve assembly scenario. You just need to demonstrate the process is robust. So I think that's, I'm not sure I've completely understood the question, but hopefully I've answered it. And then one more, it's will Exeter provide certifications for the whole valve assembly? Yes, we will. We absolutely can do that. It may not be, in some scenarios, there's some very high risk, very unique designs where we've done that, and that makes perfect sense. There's other scenarios where people are really just trying to gather all the evidence. So when they've built they're trying to gather sufficient evidence that they say, hey, my new safety system will do its job. I'm not sure that certifying every valve assembly for every plant is the right approach. That's where I think that using certified devices, valves, solenoids, actuators is critical. And then having a well-documented and even certified integration process makes more sense, because you do the process once, and then that can be leveraged over many assemblies. However, we can do unique assemblies. There's no problem with that. Those were great questions. Appreciate that. So we can leave it open another minute or so. Oh, here we go. Okay, so here's a request for an additional webinar, which certainly we can do, with the difference between mission time, proof test interval, proof test effectiveness, and useful life. And it's more about SIL verification calculations. Absolutely, we certainly can do that. Okay, and then, okay, and it will include partial stroke testing. All right, well, thank you, everybody. This has been great. I really appreciate the questions. And we'll be posting this, and I think sending everybody who attended a PDF copy of the slides and a link to the recording. And as always, please feel free to contact me or anybody at Exeter with additional questions. Oh, here's a good question. If anybody's still on, is it allowed to share the same valve by a BPCS and a safety system? It doesn't give you full independence. So in the strictest sense, no. There are some scenarios, especially if you have if you've got a dedicated safety valve and a control valve, in your calculations you can take a partial credit for that control valve. If you send me your email, I'll send you, we have a white paper, about sharing valves, and then a question about posting on internal website. I think we can do that. Just if you ask formally in an email, then we'll send you an email back saying it's okay. Thank you.